Phillis Wheatley is the only poet of African descent that we're reading on this course. Uh, as your textbook explains, she was taken from Africa by slave traders at the age of 6 or 7, brought to America and taught to read by the evangelical family that bought her. Note that her first name comes from the ship that she was transported in, the Phyllis, and her last name comes from the family that purchased her, the Wheatleys. So this in itself kind of speaks to the erasure of African identity that takes place through this the slave trade. Wheatley showed a penchant for poetry at a young age, and eventually she published this book in 1773 in London. So this is, even though she lived in Boston, so this is an example of transatlantic literary connections. We're reading her on a course about British poetry, and she's anthologized in a book of British poetry, even though she lived in Boston in pre-revolutionary America, which technically was still part of the British Empire. Note that this is also one of the first literary works by a black woman or even by an American woman. So Wheatley is very much seen as a pioneer in this field. The first poem I asked you to look at, To the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth, His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for North America, it's not a poem about slavery per se, so much as it is about pre-revolutionary politics. If you know American history, you're aware that America was very much oppressed by harsh taxation imposed by the English government. So Dartmouth in this poem is being praised as a benevolent leader. He is English, but his politics have shown him to be more sympathetic to the American people. So Wheatley is celebrating his appointment as Secretary of State. She does use her own experience as a comparison in this poem, explaining that it is the source of what she calls her love of freedom. And here in this passage in particular, we can see the logic of sensibility at work. She inculcates sympathy in the reader for her in telling her story. She says, "Whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood? I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat." So she invokes the reader's sympathy, but in the sense of demonstrating her own sympathy for the American people more generally. Because she has been through this terrible experience, she presents herself as much more capable of empathy for others. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway, that because she's endured what she has, she wants the American people to be free as well. Notice the contrast in terms of argument with the rhetoric of the prose writings we looked at, where those writers were making arguments that were based on morality and acknowledging the necessity of opposing the slave trade based on economics as well. Here we have an argument that's based primarily on feeling, which is closely allied with morality, but not quite the same thing as a rationally constructed moral argument. Rather, the argument is that is based on the capacity for fellow feeling. That if one person knows what the horrors of tyranny are like, they must therefore sympathize with someone else in a similar situation. The second poem I asked you to look at, To S.M., a young African painter on seeing his works. This poem very much reflects the more religious tone of Wheatley's work. Interestingly, it combines references to the Muse with a Christian perspective, so we can kind of see the way in which Wheatley refers to the kind of conventions of poetry and fame and painting, the idea of art as being inspired by the Muse, which kind of fades away at the end of the poem in the face of the Christian perspective. So contrasting worldly fame with a spiritual perspective, one which is characterized by a more permanent point of view, as she puts it, when these dark shades of time are chased away and darkness ends in everlasting day. In other words, at the end of time, and into a millennial perspective, for nobler themes demand a nobler strain and purer language on the ethereal plane. So here she is suggesting the insignificance of art in relation to the religious perspective, which she depicts in this poem as being fundamentally determinative. That cease, gentle muse, the solemn gloom of night now seals the fair creation from my sight. So surpassing the language of art into a language of religion.